So continuing with a typical vertebra, the body is this enlarged portion of the vertebra, and it's the weight-bearing portion. The vertebral arch is what you see here, made up of different components of the vertebrae, because it arches over the body, forming the vertebral foramen. So foramen is an opening or passageway, and what moves through here, or what it goes through here, is the spinal cord. Then there are lamellae, excuse me, which are in this location here, and also here and here. The lamellae form part of the vertebral arch, along with the pedicels, which are the portions of the vertebral arch here and here that come off of the body. So there's a pedicel here, lamella here, another lamella here, and another pedicel here, so they form the vertebral arch. Processes or bony protrusions. There's the superior and inferior articular processes, so these form the articulations where they form a joint with a bone above and below. So this is a superior view of a vertebra from above, so these would be the superior articular processes, and this is the inferior articular process. So this is the inferior view, and the facet is the part of the articular process where the joint is actually formed or where the bones actually contact each other. So facet's usually a shallow depression. And then the spinous process is this process that juts out posteriorly out to the back. You can feel these spinous processes at the back of your neck and then the back of your thorax. So notice there's your vertebral arch, there's a pedicel here, there's a lamina there, there's another lamina here, and another pedicel there. So the intervertebral foramen is an opening between vertebrae. So if you have, in this situation, 3 vertebrae in articulation stacked on top of each other, this opening between articulating or joining vertebra, that is the intervertebral foramen. There's another one here, there'll be another one up there, another one down there. So what leaves the vertebral foramen is the spinal nerves. So this arrow is following the path of the spinal cord, and that's protected by the bony vertebra, but the nerves, the spinal nerves, have to exit somewhere, and they exit out laterally through the intervertebral foramina, which is plural for foramen. Superior and inferior articular processes. This is a vertebra that's up, superior, inferior this direction, so that would be the superior articular processes, one on each side. And then there's the 2 inferior articular processes with their facets. And the reason they're in blue is because the facet is where the bones articulate with each other, so that's covered with hyaline cartilage. Here's your intervertebral discs. Yes, the processes. So notice in this diagram, this yellow thing that's coming out, that's the spinal nerve exiting from the spinal cord, and the spinal nerve exits through the vertebral column, through the intervertebral foramen. And foramina, again, is plural. Okay, let's look at some characteristics of the cervical vertebrae, the vertebrae in the neck. Excuse me. They have transverse foramen, or foramina plural. That means they have an opening in the transverse process. And only the cervical vertebrae have that. So they have 3 holes in a way. The vertebral foramen and the 2 transverse foramina. C1, the most superior cervical excuse me, vertebra, is called atlas, and it has a greatly reduced body, or spinous processes, also absent. So it's highly modified. It's the top of the vertebral column. The superior articular facets articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone of the skull. And then C2, cervical vertebra 2, is called the axis because it has a bony protrusion called the dens that sits right there and allows the atlas C1 to rotate in a rotational way around this dens, and it allows you to do that no motion with your head, left to right, no, no, no. That extra process is called the dens or the odontoid process, and that sits right in there, and it forms a pivot joint with C1, the atlas, as is seen here. Okay, so this is a posterior view. There's the spinous process of C2 axis, and there's C1 atlas. And notice how the dens sits right in that little notch and allows C1 to rotate about this axis formed by the dens of C2. Like so. So posterior view like so. Notice that C1 here is able to pivot around this axis formed by the dens of C2. And then those superior articulating processes with their facets of C1, atlas, articulate with the condylar processes of the occipital bone. So the occipital condyles, and barely visible here. That's occipital bone, the back view of the skull. So the occipital condyles of the occipital bone sit right there on the superior articulating processes and their facets of C1 atlas. Okay, so let's continue with some other cervical vertebra. C3 through 6 have the spinous process with two little protrusions, so it's called the bifid spinous process. Bifid means two, so kind of like forked in a way, like a forked tongue on, say, a snake. And then C7, the spinous process is very, well, considerably larger, and very obvious, so it's called the vertebra prominens, or the vertebra prominens. And you can feel that when you drop your head forward, if you're looking at your shoes, that big obvious bump at the back of the bottom part of the neck, you're touching the vertebra prominens of C7, which you can see right there. You can feel that easily when you drop your head down to look down. Right, the vertebra prominens of C7, cervical vertebra 7. And then the next one down, we start the thoracic vertebra with T1. Okay. So in this X-ray, we see there's a spinous process. There's the skull occipital bone, so that's got to be C1. Sorry, C1 is up here. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I forgot to count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's C7 in the neck. And if you notice something happened to this individual, there's a fracture there. The vertebra prominens of their C7 is broken. Ouch. Okay, so moving down inferiorly, the thoracic vertebra. These bones start to get bigger as we move down the vertebral column because they're supporting more weight. Many of the structures are similar to the cervical vertebrae, so we have T1 through T12, thoracic vertebra 1 through 12. Bigger and stronger than the cervical because they're supporting more weight. They are smaller than the most inferior lumbar vertebra though. They have they have costal facets to articulate with the ribs. So we can see that right here on the transverse process, and here on the body of the vertebra. So these are costal facets meaning articulation sites for the ribs that come off of there and then go forward. Most of the ribs articulate with your breastbone, your sternum, like so. So if we flip this around and have the spinous process to the right, there's the spinous processes. Here's the anterior part of the vertebra, the body. So you notice these areas in gray are the costal facets on the vertebra, and the head of one rib will come in and contact these two costal facets, and then as it comes back before it curves forward, part of the rib will attach to the transverse process. So each rib articulates with actually two vertebrae, as is seen here. And then those ribs, you see, is contacting two vertebrae on their bodies. The ribs then go posterior a little bit, contacting the costal facet on the transverse process, and then swing forward anterior, and then via cartilage articulate with the sternum, the breastbone. Okay, moving down inferior to these, we have the lumbar vertebrae. They're the largest weight-bearing vertebrae, so they have a nice large body. No costal facets because they do not articulate with the ribs. Those are only the those are only the thoracic vertebrae. So L1 through L5. And then inferior to L5 is this structure called the sacrum. That's a posterior view, that's an anterior view, this is a side lateral view. And the sacrum looks kind of weird, but that's because it's generated by the fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae that fuse by the time you're a young adult, and it's all bone at this point. Fusion begins about puberty, completed by about 25, and the sacral canal is the passageway for the spinal nerves that are coming down from the spinal cord, and then the spinal nerves exit out of their appropriate sacral foramina. So these sacral foramina are analogous to the intervertebral foramina of the other vertebra. There you go, your sacral foramina. There's posterior and anterior ones. And then this auricular surface, which is on the sides here, that surface articulates with your two hip bones, like so. So here's the front anterior view of the sacrum. This view is the same as this. So this is the articulating surface with L5, lumbar vertebra 5. And on the sides here, the articular surface of the sacrum articulates with the hip bone, one on the right, one on the left. And that joint is the sacroiliac joint. And then finally, at the far distal inferior end, we have the coccyx, which is formed by a fusion of 3 to 5 coccygeal vertebrae. And again, just like with the sacrum, they fully fuse by about age 25, and that's our tailbone. And hopefully you haven't broken your tailbone by slipping and falling on your butt. All right. Okay, let's move on to the thoracic cage, or the rib cage. Consists of the 12 thoracic vertebrae, T1 through T12. You can barely see it there. And the ribs, or the costae, 12 pair. And then the sternum anteriorly, made up of 3 components. So functions: protects the organs in here, heart, lungs, blood vessels. Attaches to muscles for respiration, the diaphragm, and also what are called intercostal muscles between the ribs to elevate the ribs when you breathe in, and to depress the ribs forcefully when you breathe out. Positioning of the vertebral column holds the vertebral column in place to a certain degree. And then movement of the upper limbs, as we'll see. The top of the sternum is where the upper limb attaches, articulates.